We will start this lesson with fixing a bug which happens when we try to reset activity. In other words, when we are assigning value null to activity ID property of timeline item object. So let's try it out. I'll click on the reset button and in a console we'll see the following error, which is happening when calling isActivityValid method. And to fix it, we have to go to timeline item component, and here within select activity event handler, which is called anytime we select new value in activity select box. And within this handler, we're trying to find activity by its ID that we have received as a parameter to this function. But anytime we reset value of the select box, this ID parameter will contain value null, so that this expression is not going to return an activity object. And in those cases, we have to fall back and return null instead, like so. And after that, we also have to modify validator for select activity event. So this validator is going to accept activity object in activity parameter. And since activity object can be null, anytime we reset value of the select box, we're going to use validator is null to allow for this value. Or in all other cases, we're going to check that the activity object will be valid by using isActivityValid validator. So now let's import isNullValidator in this component from validators module. And then we're gonna have to adjust validation logic within the timeline component as well. In this method, we also use isActivityValid validator, but since now we allow for null values as well, we're going to add a code to isNullValidator just like before, passing activity object in here. And here is the same thing, we also have to import isNullValidator into this component. And now in the browser, let's see what happens when we try to reset the value of the first select box. And this time we got error. And this is due to that same fact that whenever we reset value of the select box, it is going to trigger select activity handler within the timeline component, which in turn is going to trigger another event with the name setTimelineItemActivity to parent component, which in our case is root component. And finally, if we're going to take a look at the handler setTimelineItemActivity inside of the root component, this is exactly the function which gets triggered when we try to reset value of the select box. And while resetting the value, activity object is going to be null, so this reference to ID property will fail since activity variable is null. So we have to prevent this from happening, and we can do so by using optional chaining operator. And this way we check if activity variable will be null, we're going to fall back null value, like so, by using OR operator. And this value will be assigned to activity ID property of timeline item object. And let's do one more check in the browser. First of all, we're going to select two values by using two select boxes. And at the same time, within timeline items array, selected activity IDs have been assigned to activity ID properties of corresponding objects. And when we try to reset the value of the first select box, right after we will see that null value has been assigned to this activity ID property. So in terms of data, everything looks good, but in fact in the UI, we can see that the first select box shows wrong activity as selected, because after we reset the value, it should show default option. And now let's find out why our UI is not updated properly. So the problem is this: when we reset activity for a particular hour, we are going to assign null value to activity ID property of corresponding timeline item object. But the thing is that this timeline item object belongs to an array which is not reactive, and Vue does not monitor any changes that are being made to properties of these objects. So all we have to do is make this array reactive by using ref function, like so. And now any modifications to objects that are stored within timeline items reactive array will be monitored by Vue, and Vue can properly update our interface based on new values of properties within those timeline items objects. And in those places where we reference timeline items array, now we need to get access to a reactive array by using value property, since this variable is now reactive. So let's add the value property right here and check everything in the browser. Once again, we'll start our testing with selecting two values by using two first select boxes. And let's make sure that the appropriate selected activity IDs were assigned to activity ID properties of timeline items objects. And now, for example, if I try to remove one of the selected activities, for example, coding activity, Let's go to Activities page and remove the first activity, which is coding. Then right away on Timeline page, I will see that the first Select box shows default option instead of coding activity, because earlier coding activity was removed. And of course, Activity ID property stores value null. So now functionality for resetting select box values works as expected. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.